Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited for today's podcast. We are going to be talking about venture capital, about crypto and fintech. And joining us is Urvashi, who is a principal at Redpoint Ventures. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Lex.
My pleasure. I'm really excited about learning all the different pieces that you focus on, because those are exactly the types of things that we geek about. And so really interested in seeing kind of the type of industry developments that you're seeing from the investor's point of view, and especially as we get into 2022, and the industry changes, what the waves have shifted around. But before we get into the substance of kind of the investing bit, I'd love to find out about your journey towards venture. Where did you start and how did you get here?
Yeah. First of all, Lex, thank you so much for having me. I want to say, I've been listening to the podcast for a little bit now, and it's surreal to be on it. So thank you so much for reaching out, and I'm really excited about this session. So my story into venture is to start from way back. I'm actually from India. I'm from a small town called Assam, and I spent most of my life there. I got to the US when I started my undergrad at Middlebury College. And during undergrad, I actually had my first exposure to venture. I worked at a US venture fund in their China office. And at that time, developed a fascination for the job because working with founders was so exciting. My parents also are entrepreneurs themselves back in India. And so I love this idea of being close to people that are working on new ideas and helping them get their businesses up to speed. I realized it's not something that I would be able to do right out of college without any business background. So I decided to go into consulting. I got my first job at Ernst & Young. I was working as an M&A consultant there, helping Fortune 500 companies execute large mergers and acquisitions. Did that for about 3 years and then made the move over to Boston Consulting Group, where I was a more general management consulting. And over there, I actually worked really closely with a bunch of financial institutions. So I've worked with large banks, credit card companies, lending companies, wealth management companies, helping them on a variety of things, everything from, pricing, how do we grow, what should we acquire, things like that. But had always had this fascination for venture. And so with that, I went into business school. And once I got to business school, really started to make the shift to venture and worked at a couple different funds and ultimately ended up at Redpoint Ventures. And so at Redpoint, we have two funds. We have an early stage fund and a growth fund. I'm a part of the early stage fund there, where we're currently investing out of our eighth fund, which is a $500 million fund. And we typically make C to Series B investments, although most of our investments are focused at the Series A stage. And at Redpoint, I spend a lot of my time looking at all things consumer, which includes a lot of fintech and crypto increasingly nowadays.
That's awesome. And thank you for the kind words. I mean, it must be quite a transition from advice and, the consulting type skill set into trying to make these kind of editorial or these substantive industry-wide judgments about what the future looks like. Do you find yourself using a different part of your brain or a different part of kind of your training? How does it feel to have gone through that transition?
Yeah, I mean there are many differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. I would say the biggest differences are, in VC, there's no such thing as immediate feedback. I invest in a company and really we're making bets that are 5 to 7 years out. So the feedback cycles in VC are very long. And then the other thing is VC, you're investing in teams, but a lot of times it tends to be an individual sport. You're going after hunting for companies, you're meeting them on your own. And then a lot of times you're the one, going deep on a space, you're making a determination on what's interesting and what's not. So there's a lot less of a team element than what I was used to in consulting. And then the other thing I would say is there's a lot more hustle in VC. So, in consulting, for instance, when I was working at BCG, I didn't really need a personal brand. I was working under the BCG banner, I was a consultant and part of a larger company. But here in VC, I have to go out, I have to make a name for myself. I have to go out and find companies and convince them why they should take money from me. So there's a lot more that you need to do in terms of building a personal brand that matters in VC that I wasn't used to in consulting. So those are some of the big differences, I would say. But there are a lot of similarities in terms of, the skills that I rely on for my day-to-day. I learned a lot when I was a consultant in terms of how to think about different industries, how to come up to speed on an industry really quickly, and how to synthesize large amounts of information and formulate an opinion and communicate that really clearly. I also learned how to work really, really late hours. So that always helps. So I would say there are things that I rely on from my consulting training to help me get better at the VC job.
I'm sorry to hear about the long hours. As somebody who has done that to themselves over and over again, 2022 is the year of rest. That's the rule. Okay, so in your coverage at Redpoint, you've mentioned that you're doing early stage and you're looking at fintech and you're looking at crypto as well. Can you talk about kind of fintech, and then as you were getting up to speed on the sector, what was your process? What were the tools that you were using to learn about it, and what were the elements that kind of clicked together for you to create a mental model that you rely on now?
Yeah, in terms of elements to get up to speed, I would say I benefited from the familiarity I had with this world from having worked with a lot of the large players in the space back in my BCG days. But I would say what's been most helpful in terms of getting up to speed, the first is just meeting companies in the space. Honestly, the founders that we work with, they are thinking of the future. So there's no better way to get up to speed on a space than to talk with people who are actually building in it, because chances are they have thought way more deeply about this than anyone else. So talking to founders, I found, is probably the most helpful. It's also really, really helpful to talk to buyers. So we've spent a lot of time, for instance, going deep on the CFO tech stack, and in order to formulate a thesis around what's interesting there, we spend a lot of time talking to companies, small, medium, and large, talking to CFOs in those companies, talking to individual contributors, and figuring out where the pain points are in their day to day, and what are the kinds of things they're looking to buy, and how do they make a decision? What are their buying criteria for those things? So those conversations have also been really helpful in developing a framework for what's out there and what are the opportunities.
What is this thing, the CFO tech stack? Just
Yeah,
if you could open that up.
Yeah, so this is a space that I went pretty deep into with a couple of colleagues at Redpoint, I would say last year. And the CFO tech stack is really all of the software that the finance department of a company relies on to do their jobs. And that can span everything from, the accounting, the backbone of a system, the ERP, to payroll systems, to whatever they're using for FP&A, spend management, APAR, bookkeeping. So the whole gamut of things, all of the software that's used by each of the divisions within finance is what we refer to as the CFO tech stack.
What is the size of these markets? Like, can you give us a little bit of a scale for the spend or the revenue pools or any other kind of intuitive metrics that you had built around when looking at it?
Yeah, so the good thing about the CFO tech stack is this is software that literally every company needs. The sophistication of that software might vary from if you're talking to a small startup to a large company, but the market is enormous. This is a space where you've seen companies like Bill.com come up. You've seen SAP, Oracle, Workday, these sorts of companies, which are giants, obviously, come up. So the spend here is huge. The way we bucket it, because we found that like keeping your customer persona in mind is very important, because there are so many differences in terms of the CFO organization in a small company versus a large company, how they operate, number of people they have in the organization, therefore the tools they need. We found it helpful to look at it in terms of small, medium, and large segments. So in the small segment, we put companies that have anywhere below 50 employees total in the company. They're making about below 10 million in revenue, and we find that they are spending up to 5K a month on financial tools. Then you have the medium-sized companies, anywhere up to 500 employees, and they're spending anywhere up to 15 to 20K on financial tools per month. Then you have the large companies, which is anywhere greater than 500 employees, and they're spending 20, 30, 40,000, maybe $100,000, depending on the size, on these tools. So the market is enormous, and these are tools that are required for the team to do their job. So the willingness to spend is high as well.
I have so many questions about this market, but it is so amorphous and big that I feel like we need to chisel some of the definitions down a little bit more. What are the basic things? What are the functions that the finance arm of a company needs to do? If you kind of slow it down to money in motion or money at rest, what are the fundamentals? And maybe are those any different from the consumer side? Because I think a lot of people understand the consumer side intuitively, and it's a little bit more complicated when you're describing the business.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences as well. Maybe I'll start with the business side and kind of dig deeper into some of the areas. So, a big job of the finance function at a company is to take information from different parts of the company, reconcile that together, and come up with a historical view of what happened in the company in the past quarter or in the past year and make sense of that. So that can be in the form of reports, so your financial statements that are getting prepared every quarter. And in order to make those financial statements, you need to even go a level deeper and figure out what actually was our revenue, what actually was our spend for the year. So in order to do that, it's actually a lot more complicated than you would think it is. So for instance, in order to figure out your spend, you have to take invoices, you have to reconcile them. First of all, you have to figure out, is this a legit invoice or not? If it is, you have to make those payments. Once the payment has been made, you have to reconcile that to the GL. And in order to reconcile, you need to figure out what kind of expense was this? What bucket does it fall into? So there's a lot of like manual work that happens in doing all of that. Once you are able to you reconcile it to a particular bucket, then you have an accurate spend, a historical spend of the company. So that's one big piece of it. Then putting together financial statements is a historical exercise, but oftentimes one change we saw when we spent time in it is finance is increasingly becoming more of a strategic function where it's not just putting together a historical perspective of what happened in the company. It's also forward looking and thinking about what does the future look like? How should we predict revenue? And by the way, like getting that right is very important for companies because it determines how you're going to spend money. For a startup, how are you going to manage burn? For a public company, what are you going to communicate out to the street? So how do we predict our financial statements? So how do we do budgeting and planning becomes very important, and accordingly, how do we spend money becomes very important. So there's an element of bookkeeping and close and financial planning for the future that again is very important. Another area that is important when it comes to finance is payroll. This can, sit with HR or with finance, but typically payroll is the biggest expense for a company. And so managing that, making sure that people are paid the right amount at the right time is also a big function. So those are some of the buckets that I think about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because the description of getting the books together and having financial statements as being this existential thing, if you compare it to the consumer side, you have data aggregation and personal financial management tooling, and people like that. It's kind of a vitamin, like it makes things easier, but it's not a lifesaver. Whereas in the small business or certainly the public company context, the large business company context, getting that right is a life-saving thing that you do. You cannot get that wrong. Can you talk at all about what is the state of the infrastructure there? Like, what is the quality of the piping? What is the quality, and how modern is the wholesale banking infrastructure that exists to support these activities?
Yeah. So you're asking specifically about things on the banking side?
Certainly on the banking side, but I guess the accounting systems as well, like the ecosystem around these functions, like how modern are they versus how much fixing do they need? How much modernization do they need?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things, referring back to my point earlier about talking to buyers, two things that were very interesting and cut across, most people we spoke to in this world. One is that finance is such an important function. Most buyers tend to be relatively risk averse when it comes to buying new tools for this category. And not just risk averse, they also are, always chasing sort of the next close deadline. So there isn't really an ideal time to buy new financial software. So that means a lot of companies are still using software from the incumbents and, software from many decades ago. because there isn't really a natural inclination to try new things when it comes to finance. The other thing is finance, a lot of times, unlike sales, for instance, isn't really a revenue generating function. So there isn't a ton of willingness to spend for new categories or like little improvements when it comes to finance. So as a result, we've seen that a lot of companies are still on tech stacks that are from many, many years ago. And that leads to a few problems and mainly manifests in a lot of manual work and having to have a larger finance team to keep up with that manual work. So some of the gaps in the infrastructure that we see today, for instance, in financial planning and analysis, a lot of the work tends to happen in Excel and Google Sheets. Even with companies that are using tools like Anaplan or Adaptive, they will default to Excel for certain parts of the process. So when you imagine like doing the budgeting process for a large company, say a company that has more than 1,000 people, what the finance leader is doing is they are sending out this Excel sheet or this Google sheet to different leaders in the organization to ask them, give us the inputs for what your budget for this next quarter or this next year looks like. So you can imagine like that is a very error prone process that ends up taking up a lot of time. So that's one area where financial planning and analysis, we find, things break down and there's an opportunity maybe for new companies to build something better.
Yeah, I want to do one more double click here. And maybe as advice for, not necessarily advice, but if there's somebody who's an entrepreneur in the space and is thinking about go to market, is thinking about growing a company that targets this particular buyer demographic, what are potential paths that you've seen that are successful examples, maybe companies that you've liked, that you've talked to, not necessarily that you've invested in, but just that are good examples of companies who've been able to crack this puzzle and figure it out. And in particular, there must be different paths to take, whether it's starting with servicing lots of small companies that could be willing to adopt new tooling and then graduating to big companies, or maybe somebody chunks off, former division of some other business and starts positioning it as an enablement software. What are some patterns that you've seen where companies have been able to kind of build a business into this part of a client base, which might be a little bit more hesitant to do the new things?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I would highlight. One is even though we talk about how Excel is not a perfect tool, finance teams also love Excel, right? Because of its flexibility. So when you're introducing a new tool, there is this idea that you're trying to introduce change, but you have to do it in a way that feels familiar. That's not a completely new thing altogether. So one example of a successful tactic that we've seen is, for instance, this company called OnPlan that's building financial planning and analysis tools. What they start out as their base is Google Sheets. So most of the work today is done in Google Sheets, and then OnPlan will take that, ingest it into its own system, and generate great tooling and dashboards out of it. But for the customer, the interface when they have to actually do modeling is still Google Sheets. So that's a nice way to bridge the worlds that the customer is familiar with while also adding new functionality onto that. So that was an interesting tactic that we saw. The other thing I have to say, and I don't quite have a great answer for this, but the other thing that companies building in this space have to grapple with is a lot of times if you're building a financial planning and analysis tool, it's not really a self-serve motion. Like you can do some extent of product-led growth, but at the end of the day, you're taking someone's existing financial model, which tends to be very complex and convoluted. Remember, that's the whole issue, and transporting that into your own system. So that requires a lot of handholding and manual assistance, which means that your cost of sales, your customer acquisition cost, ends up being quite high. So you have to find a way to thread the needle there where you're doing onboarding and customer acquisition in a way that is proportionate to your ACVs. Because again, if you're going after the small end of the spectrum, the ACVs at that end aren't that high. So figuring out how to do onboarding well, how to show that time to value quickly, and how to convince people to try out your software without making them go through this lengthy process of of transition from their existing software to your new software is going to be really, really important.
Super interesting. Thank you for opening that up. And I'm going to use this as a transition moment because we've been talking about very traditional businesses often that have this finance function that is part of the operation of the company that needs to often runs things still through spreadsheets, and needs digitization of their tooling. And it's still like hand-to-hand human combat figuring out how to onboard these types of companies into modern software. And so I want to use that as a frame to look at the other trends that you're investing in and pursuing, which is around crypto assets. And crypto assets, at the core of the promise of crypto assets is this distributed ledger that removes all need for accounting, full stop, because accounting is just true and computational and part of the ledger, as well as, all the digital assets and business on chain and so on. Can you talk a little bit about how within the venture firm and within your practice, how you made the transition to thinking about crypto rails, and what was interesting maybe about that theme to you and the firm, as well as, like from a timing perspective, like when did it become acceptable to start investing in the sector?
So Redpoint actually made our first investment in crypto back in about 2012. We invested in a company called BitGo, which actually has done pretty well for us. It's a custody solution. And over the years, we've invested on and off. But really last year is when we decided, wow, this is a big shift. And the next decade is probably going to be one where crypto it becomes really, really important. And now is the time when those foundational companies are being built, when the infrastructure, the building blocks are being put in place to enable the shift for the next decade. And so it became clear to us that this is a space where we need to be spending time. And so with that, we, just last year, we invested a ton in the category. We've invested in companies like Dune Analytics, Arbitrum, which is a layer 2 scaling solution for Ethereum, Alchemy, which is a developer tools company in the space, as well as a few others. Miston Labs, for instance, is another one. It's a layer 1 from the Novi team. So we've made a lot of bets in the category and are looking to make more. And in general, when we look at the crypto space, we kind of divide it up into the world of infrastructure and applications. On the infrastructure side, we are very interested in, new layer 1s and layer 2s, especially ones that are focusing on things that haven't quite been solved yet among the existing layer 1s and layer 2s. So privacy, for instance, is one thing that's interesting to us. On the application side, we are seeing a lot of movement when it comes to NFTs. So all facets of NFTs, whether that is NFT marketplaces, NFTs and other ecosystems like Solana, Avalanche, Near, we're seeing big themes around the financialization of NFTs. So using NFTs as collateral for lending or peer-to-peer lending of NFTs. So that's a big theme that we're interested in. We're also seeing, by the way, really interesting things in the intersection of fintech and crypto. So that's things that fintech applications that are enabled by crypto, or things that look like fintech on the front end, but DeFi in the back. And really, like, that is an idea that's really interesting to us because, so far, crypto is still sort of relegated to the early adopters, I would say. It's not mainstream yet. And what makes us really excited is what are the things that need to happen for crypto to become mainstream? And putting it in the interface of fintech that people are used to is one of those areas that we think is quite promising. So some examples that we've seen there are, for instance, high yield savings accounts, enabling payments using crypto. So we're spending a lot of time in that space as well. And then related to that, we're now seeing companies come up that are allowing traditional financial institutions like banks and fintechs to offer crypto products. And they're offering the rails to do that. Just as, banking as a service did in the last couple of years, we're seeing banking as a service adapted to crypto. So that's another interesting theme that we are spending time on.
Gotcha. Thank you. So that was a lot of very dense information, and I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit. And I think it's very notable that your language changed a lot into the vernacular of crypto native stuff when describing, all those investments and those themes. And in particular, sort of the relationship and the storytelling of what each one of them is supposed to do, and so on, is, like from layer ones, or the conversation about privacy, or the securitization of NFTs. Those all presuppose a lot of kind of underlying assumptions as to what is going on and why. And so I want to go back to the thing you said up front, which is you want to be participating in the shift. And so in the description of the tooling, the fintech tooling for the finance suite of companies, what's going on there is roughly a company is selling software to make a process more efficient or cheaper, and so you're like enabling software by lowering cost. And here we're talking about something else, and potentially a much deeper opportunity that is, in your firm's view, kind of like a decade worth of focus as we transition from A to B. Can you talk a little bit about what is that transition? What is the shift that one would make these secular big infrastructure rail investments about? What is the fundamental thing that you're seeing that is so attractive in terms of the world that we're going to?
So I mean, crypto is not a new technology, right? It's been around for more than a decade at this point. What got us really excited is in the last year is when you saw a lot of these things almost go mainstream. So Coinbase had their IPO. NFTs have become household names just in the last year. And now we're getting to the point where, regular folks that are not investors in crypto will ask me about NFTs. They'll ask me about, which one which one should I be buying? What wallet should I get? So it's very much in the mainstream consciousness. And I think you're finally getting to the point where, so far it was all about putting the infrastructure in place for us to even be able to build applications. But now we're getting to the point where we are building applications in crypto that are actually, impacting people's day to day. So those are the things that I'm excited about. So for instance, in the music industry, I'm sure you've heard of this company, Royal. They recently did a drop with Lil Nas X, where Lil Nas X put out a couple of his songs as NFTs. And what that's doing is it's making music, which was traditionally only, the publishers and record labels would be able to invest in those things. It's opening the ownership of that up to the community. And it's turning music into a financial asset that anyone can invest in. You can invest now in the people that you believe in the whose art you've been following, all your life. So that's a tangible change that's brought about by crypto, and it's possible because we now have the infrastructure in place to invest in things like that. So that's like, those are some examples of real life changes that crypto is bringing about that I'm excited about, and that's the shift.
And the timeline is, I'm interested in this idea of the long term versus the short term. So what is possible? What are the cycles? Like, what's possible in the short term? And I think this idea that the foundational companies are being built now is really interesting, because BitGo, the custodian, which we've had on the podcast before their acquisition, is a really interesting story about a particular cycle, about the cycle of this idea of owning a crypto investment asset, and then that goes into your portfolio, and then you get investment returns, and it's custodied and safe, and everything's fine. It's just like traditional finance, and you're good. And that particular theme and vector feels like it's hit institutional finance, and now lots of companies want access to the asset class, and they want sort of financial infrastructure that's able to provide, let's say, wallets or keys or whatever sort of intermediation service on behalf of customers using software that is blockchain native, right? So there's been kind of this journey for a company like BitGo towards becoming really mainstream in terms of what financial institutions want. But I think, like you're alluding to, there are a lot of foundational key companies, the version of Netscape or the version of Netflix and everything else that starts with net, that are being put together today. And I'd love to just kind of hear more of your thoughts around this idea of what's special about this moment, and maybe what's the outlook for it.
I mean, when you look at what's special in the moment, like I just would refer to some of our investments. Like Arbitrum, for instance, is a company that we invested in last year. They are building layer two scaling solution for Ethereum. So the idea is that, I mean, Ethereum has been enduring for several years, probably has the biggest developer community of all the chains today, right? But it's faced scalability challenges. If we want to continue to make it possible for people to build on Ethereum, we need to figure out a way to make it scale. And Arbitrum is doing that through an optimistic rollup. So the idea there is that the infrastructure for people to actually build on top of Ethereum is being built today. And those companies that are making it possible to build on that infrastructure are being built today. So if in the future, if layer twos really take off, we could see about 80 to 90% of the transaction happen on a layer two because they are more efficient at carrying out those transactions than a layer one is. If that's true, then the layer twos that are being built today that will have the go to market, that will have the developer traction, are going to be really, really big companies in the future. And like now is the time to invest in those companies. So that's what I mean by the foundation is being built today. The infrastructure where a lot of this is going to happen is being built today. And these companies are still relatively new at this point, but I think we'll begin to see winners emerge very quickly. And we want to be making those bets on them now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're talking in large part, both probably, certainly in the case of Arbitrum, but in other solutions that are there for scaling, we're talking about computation and making computation available. So the ability to write different types of software, whether it's, art focused and NFT focused and music focused, or whether it's decentralized finance, and it's the ability to write that software, but have that software be very computationally intensive so that you can run large worldwide exchanges, you can run gigantic streaming markets, you can run big identity systems, things of that nature. And so, we are in this moment where a lot of that is being experimented with, kind of, and turned on. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to invest into an Arbitrum or a Miston or a Dune? Like, for sure, there is the equity slug that you're buying, but then how does your firm and how do you think about the token and the interplay between the token and the equity as an investment? And then maybe more broadly from that, like, how do you think about value capture within the token that makes it useful and valuable?
I think tokens are one thing that make crypto companies so special because it's really like token is sort of the new customer acquisition tool because using a token, a crypto company can make sure that their early adopters are rewarded and then therefore create more incentives for people to become early adopters, to refer their friends, and to also become invested in the growth of that community. And so much of crypto comes down to, for instance, for companies like Arbitrum, it's all about how do we attract early developers? How do we make them choose Arbitrum as the layer that they want to build on that will be the layer to invest their time in for the future? And so like using a token is a really great way to incentivize early adopters and community. So I mean, as VCs, we recognize the importance of that token and we encourage our companies to have tokens. We also think that a lot of the value for a crypto company that has a token will probably ultimately accrue to the token. So when we invest in companies that will plan on launching tokens in the future, usually the way we structure it is because we're early stage, we're probably coming in before the token has even been launched. In most cases. And so the way we structure the deals is we buy into equity, but that equity gives us a conversion to tokens. We'll convert to tokens at some predetermined rate later on, once the company does launch a token. And we believe that's where we'll see most of the value accrue for these types of companies.
Are there any rules of thumb for what kinds of tokens become valuable? Because we see a lot of different types of attempts at mechanisms in the market, whether it's some utility token that gates the usage of a platform, or whether it's a governance token that gives people the ability to influence roadmaps, or whether it's a cash flow token that end of the day rewards the holders. How do you think about what makes a good mechanism for value accrual versus what's sort of just theatrical?
I mean, a token has to ultimately have value, right? So the way we look at it for traditional companies, you look at the equity as a promise for future cash flows. So a token should be looked at similarly. By investing in this token, what rights am I getting and how does that convert to future cash flows? So tokens that actually give users some distribution of fees or distribution of income in the future, I think are more valuable than tokens that simply give you, say, governance rights. Of course, some tokens will start out as governance rights, but in the future will, maybe distribute a portion of fees to their holders. So in general, our framework is that a token has to make sense, and a token has to have actual utility where you're actually sharing some monetary benefit with the token holders.
Gotcha. Super interesting to hear the investment view on that. We talked earlier a little bit about communities and creators, like the music example that you've given. One of the trends that I'd love to land us on is this combination of pop culture and the creator economy, as lots and lots of people find side gigs and expressive ways to make money off the internet. And the combination of that pop culture and media with financial technology, and in particular crypto-based financial technology. How do you think about what's going to happen there, and what are the different vectors of change that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about NFTs, I think that's probably the most interesting thing happening in the creator economy today. I spend a lot of time looking at creator economy companies just outside of Web3 as well, just in the Web2 world too. Honestly, I think the biggest problem with the creator economy is it's still, I mean, everyone talks about how more and more people are deciding to become creators, but the reality is, in order to actually make money as a creator is still really, really hard. It's only the most elite creators that are able to sustain a living by doing that. Most people will still do it as a side gig, or will do it for a few years and then realize, that it's not enough and then churn out, or will continue to do it part-time. So that's the biggest problem in the creator economy, is that it's really difficult for a creator to get compensated for the work that they're doing, even though that work is really valuable. Like, I personally look at how I myself am spending my time, and it used to be I was, watching TV, or I would read books, and now I spend most of my time on Instagram and TikTok, right? So the amount of time that we're spending with these creators has increased, maybe tenfold, but the compensation that's going directly in their pockets is not. And so crypto brings about a way to change that, to actually put creators directly in touch with their fans. And there's this idea of, you only need 1,000 true fans. And it actually gives people a way to invest in the creators they love. And that, I think, is super exciting, because now for the first time you have these primitives that will allow creators to make money the way that they should be compensated. So just taking the example of music, I mean, it takes, don't quote me exactly on this, but it takes about 1 million views on YouTube will probably get you about $1,000, $2,000 in income. And then the other thing about musicians, for instance, is, for every dollar that they're making, they're only getting about maybe 10, 20 cents, because the rest goes to intermediaries. So crypto is bringing about ways to change that by cutting out all of the middlemen. And so those are some of the reasons why I think this is probably the biggest shift in the creator economy, the most exciting shift that we've seen in a long time, because it fundamentally changes how creators and their fans can work together.
Fascinating conversation, and was really interested about that arc that you've taken us from fintech to crypto to how we're seeing NFTs grow and evolve. If our listeners want to find out more about you, about Redpoint, and follow your accounts, where should they go?
Yeah, please email me at urvashi@redpoint.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at Urvashi Barooah. And I look forward to hopefully hearing from many of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Lex.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.